Hi everyone, I'm Eve and welcome back to my channel. Today I am very excited to talk to you about chapters 2 and 3 from History of Yoga All Started on a Stone by Ramis Kachar. If you haven't seen the introduction as well as the chapter 1 discussion, I will try to link the video up here. I don't know exactly where it's going to go just yet. However, feel free to check that out. With that, we'll get right into discussing chapter 2. My first question for you all has to do with how old do you think yoga is? Since chapter 2 is titled Older Than You Think, and it covers the pre-Vedic era, which starts around 5000 BC. However, Ramis does note that this is a controversial number, and I myself have seen different sources, couldn't tell you what those sources are off the top of my head, say various dates from all the way back to 10,000 BC up to 5000 BC. So there is a lot of debate on when the pre-Vedic era and the seeds that would later be sown that became yoga, Hinduism, and Buddhism first began. Again, the pre-Vedic era being the era that the seeds that would later become yoga, Hinduism, and Buddhism are where these seeds are created and then laying the foundation for the Vedic era of things. And there are some major things that happened. And to go back to where this all started, it is believed that it was subcontinental of modern day India. With that, the people who lived in this area began to think about what it meant to be human and their interactions with nature and the greater universe as a whole and how they all fit into that. And they found that they would share these different ideas and thoughts between different communities orally, and this is where they believe that mantras came from. And if you haven't heard of what a mantra is, I'm going to quote Ramis here just to make sure that you kind of understand what they are in the modern day, and then also quoting him to understand what they were in the pre-Vedic era. This is on page 29 of the Kindle version of the book. Our current understanding of them in the secular West is that mantras are something that you repeat to yourself to further your own beliefs and goals. The original mantras were to impart universal knowledge so that humanity as a whole could advance. And I found this really interesting, and it makes sense that these things that you're repeating over and over again are going to eventually develop into something, and the repeated process is to share that knowledge with other people, and their original goal is thought to be the advancement of humanity within the universe. Whereas I feel like today's, as Ramis kind of mentions, is more of an individual practice that people use. And as an instructor, I've been asked, well, what's the difference between a mantra and an affirmation? And I've never really felt like I have a good answer to that. So if you're a yoga instructor, what is your answer? What is the difference between an affirmation and a mantra? I feel like a mantra has a little bit more of an intention behind it. So, again, working to manifest the goals and the beliefs that you're currently on track for. Whereas I feel like an affirmation more has to do with reaffirming different beliefs that we have about ourselves or about our lives, and that they can be reduced down to even a single word. So maybe it's just like the word positive instead of saying a whole affirmational sentence of I am positive. It's embodying the word of positive, whether that's positive in your friend group, positive at work, positive in class, positive in your mind. And I feel like that's kind of the difference that I see as an instructor. So I'd love to hear, even if you're not an instructor, what do you think the difference is between a mantra and an affirmation? And if you've never heard of a mantra, Feel free to let me know what you thought it was. Another theme that Ramis brings up in this chapter is the practice of asceticism. And this is the practice of abstaining from worldly pleasures, from my understanding. So, not eating, not sleeping, not engaging with the world. And again, Ramis would go into more detail about this within the book. However, I think it's very similar to the idea of like abstaining that we might see in the modern with monks and taking themselves out of society. I believe this is what Buddha had done. He took himself away from the place where he lived and he sat under a tree to allow himself to really reflect and observe the world both outside of him and also within him, rather than being distracted by all of these incoming things that we end up being surrounded with as a person that lives in society or even out in nature. These different practices from the asceticism as well as the mantras, I laugh because I'm not sure if I said that word correctly. And anyway, these practices that came up in the Vedic era or the pre-Vedic era led to the Vedic era, which leads us into chapter 3, which is titled The Rising Sun God. And again, this is the Vedic era starting from about 1700 BC going until 500 BC. Again, Ramis notes that this is a controversial number since a lot of things weren't written down. Instead, they were passed orally or verbally from person to person, and it's hard to track down an exact date on when the pre-Vedic era ended and the Vedic era began. According to this book, the Vedic era really marks the place where the seeds are sown or a foundation is being laid. So if our pre-Vedic era is the seeds that would be sown into the ground, then the Vedic era is actually the process of laying that groundwork or sowing the seeds to become religion, spirituality, or again, more specifically into Hinduism, Buddhism, yoga, and so on and so forth. Again, in the pre-Vedic era, we had these practices of mantras or information being passed from person to person. And then in the Vedic era, this is where all of that information is going to be compiled and then shared with different people. And one of our big players is Veda Vyasa, and I'm not fluent in Sanskrit. I'm not very well versed in Sanskrit, so please bear with me with my pronunciation. I am still learning about all of it, and I have to try in order to learn. Anyway, they came from what is modern day Pakistan and India, and their whole goal was to collect all of this knowledge in the world and then be able to divide it into different sections or books or different texts. However, the thing is, everything is still being orally given from person to person or verbally passed down. So nothing has been written down at this point in time. However, Veda Vyasa has been compiling all of this different wisdom and then separating it into various texts. And to quote Ramis, the purpose behind the Vedas was to span to cover aspects of daily life all the way to metaphysical discussions, as well as the philosophical aspect about being able to achieve a state of mindfulness to understand humanity's and the individual's connection to nature. From my understanding, Ramis is explaining that the Vedas were essentially a framework on how to live your day-to-day life, how to live your spiritual life, how to live and coexist with nature, and again, giving you the knowledge and the wisdom that had been passed from community to community as well as person to person. There are four major Vedas, and they are the Rig Veda, the Samaveda, Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. However, they did note that the last one was established much later than the original three Vedas, and sometimes they're lumped together, sometimes they're not. The big one that Ramis wants to discuss is the Rig Veda, since it is the oldest of all four of the texts or the books. And specifically from his book, he states that they're a collection of poems that are focused on divinity and enlightenment, which are full of metaphors and analogies. And specifically, the Rig Veda is important to this topic because this is where the term yoga or to yoke was coined. And if you've never heard the definition of to yoke or yoking, it means to bring two different things together. And from my perspective, in the modern sense, we're practicing bringing our body together with our mind. And that's done through, again, you do it through the 8 limbs of yoga. Oftentimes it's done or practiced, I should say, in class when you're practicing asana. And the style of yoga that I teach is vinyasa, which is where we're linking our breath and our movement together. So we have to be very present in the mind as well as our body in order to make that connection and that motion to happen. And that's part of why I believe that it is a moving meditation, because again, you are present in what you're doing in order to link your breath and your movement together. Additionally, Ramis does note that Veda Vyasa was not the only person who was involved in the creation of the Vedas. Instead, there were other key players who were adding to the collection of mantras and helping to distribute them into different places. And one of the people he mentioned specifically is Vash is Vash Ishtha, who had contributed to the Rig Veda. And again, the Rig Veda is very much focused on the religious, spiritual, divinity side of this knowledge that is being passed on, whereas the other Vedas focus more, well, one of them changes things to make them more of a chant to be able to repeat easily or to be able to sing. And then the other ones focus on either just sharing stories that might be interesting or valuable to pass on, as well as activities of daily living and information regarding those. Again, quoting Ramis specifically, during this period of time, the Vedas were used as a way of understanding and, to some extent, control nature and the cosmos. This is where rituals began to take place, and rituals were critical for the success of this. Unfortunately, nature is not able to be controlled by these things, and people began to question the efficacy of the Vedas and whether or not they were valuable information, which eventually led to additional text, which we'll talk about. The Brahmanas are still part of the Vedic era, and they are thought to have popped up around 900 BC, and these are thought to be comments or additions onto the Vedas instead of their own separate text. And they made these rituals or mantras that were being used or repeated or practiced, very, very specific. And there were even comments that if you didn't practice it exactly as the text states, then they won't work. And this includes the intonation of your voice, what time you practice, where you practice, how you do your practice, all of these different aspects that in reality, who knows if everyone was doing them exactly the same way that the text was saying, because they were so specific and there's so much nuance that could happen. Like maybe your hair is in the wrong spot and that could make your ritual incorrect. At least that's what I'm imagining, that you can't narrow down every single tiny detail to be perfect so that way everybody would practice the same way. However, that was the intention behind the Brahmana texts and additions to the Vedas. What's more is this is also where the ideas of karma, selfless action, and holistic health begin to form, or the idea starts. And later they're expanded on a little bit more in the Aranyaka text. However, the Aranyaka texts focus much more on the inner world, and they thought of philosophical work surrounding the soul, and again, diving into the ideas of karma and dharma, which would eventually lead to more things that we know today. So, towards the end of this chapter, it's elaborated on that the Vedic era was really a place for the concept of a higher being, a universal power. All of those kind of thoughts and ideas were being formed into a concept, and still, yoga hasn't really made its way into conception yet. It's still laying that foundation and the groundwork. Perhaps the seed is being sprouted to be able to grow into what we know as modern day yoga. That brings us to the end of chapter 3 and on to next week's reading, which is chapter 4, which is titled Where It All Began. And this chapter will focus on the pre-classical era, 500 to 200 BCE. Well, I'm a little overloaded with all of the information that I learned from chapters 2 and 3. I still feel like the book is doing a good job of keeping things simple, to the point, and easy to understand, where you can follow along the major points in the timeline. And one of the things I learned was how old mantras were and where they originally started and their intention behind them. And I feel like we use them today, or they're brought up today, without a necessarily a clear understanding of what they're used for or where they came from. With that, I want to open it back up to some of the questions that I had throughout this video. The first one being, did you know that yoga was that old? And how old did you think yoga was? Did you know what a mantra was before this? Or has your definition of a mantra changed? And what other surprising fact did you learn from these two chapters? Let me know in the comments. And again, next week we're reading chapter 4. So I hope to see you in the discussions. And then next week, bye.